When Carmen Isabella Morales spent her last $200 on a crumbling lighthouse at a coastal bankruptcy auction, it was a desperate gamble to secure shelter for herself after losing everything to crushing debt. Following her husband's sudden death in a workplace accident and the devastating legal fees that consumed their life savings, she never imagined that a collapsing wall in the lighthouse keeper's quarters would reveal a hidden chamber containing centuries-old maps, a sea captain's journal, and a collection of ruby-encrusted artifacts belonging to the infamous pirate Captain Sebastian Montero, whose legendary lost treasure had been sought by historians and fortune hunters for over 280 years. A discovery that would make her the target of ruthless treasure hunters, thrust her into high-stakes negotiations with maritime museums and archaeological societies, and ultimately lead to an expedition that would forever change her life and rewrite the history of colonial Caribbean piracy. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell us which state you're watching from. And if this journey moves you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something absolutely mind-blowing for you. The foreclosure notice arrived on a storm-lashed Thursday morning, tucked between a medical bill and a credit card statement, as if its life-shattering contents were just another piece of ordinary mail. Notice of property seizure, 18 days to satisfy outstanding obligations. Carmen Isabella Morales stared at the bold scarlet letters, feeling her world collapse as she stood in the tiny kitchen of her seaside cottage in Coral Bay, California. Through the rain-streaked window, she could see the turbulent pewter waters of Monterey Bay that had been both sanctuary and tormentor since Diego's passing 11 months ago. "Please not now," Carmen whispered, her trembling fingers scanning the document for any possible reprieve or extension. There wasn't one. The entire stretch of oceanfront cottages had been purchased by luxury resort developers planning an elite wellness retreat. All residents had 18 days to settle their debts or face immediate eviction. No exceptions, no mercy, no second chances. At 49, Carmen had never imagined she would find herself here, a widow with a master's degree in physical therapy, recently laid off when her rehabilitation clinic was absorbed by a corporate healthcare chain, and now staring down homelessness in a rental market that seemed deliberately designed to exclude people exactly like her. She set the seizure notice on the weathered wooden counter and drew a shuddering breath, mentally cataloging her rapidly diminishing options. Her savings had dwindled to exactly $247 after 11 months of legal battles with Diego's employer over the workplace accident, funeral expenses, and a crushing weight of bills that kept arriving even after death had supposedly settled all accounts. Her younger brother lived in Denver and was struggling through his own divorce proceedings. Friends had already extended themselves beyond reason during those first devastating weeks after Diego's death. Carmen walked to the living room window, her gaze drawn to the lighthouse that stood like a stone sentinel on the jagged promontory beyond her cottage. For 18 years, it had been the constant backdrop to her marriage with Diego, its powerful beams sweeping across their cottage each night like a protective guardian watching over their dreams. Now it stood as abandoned as she felt, decommissioned 6 years ago, when satellite navigation systems had rendered human lighthouse keepers obsolete, a relic of a more personal time. She lifted the framed photograph of Diego and herself on their wedding day. His construction supervisor uniform was crisp and proud beside her flowing white dress, both of them radiant with the confidence that they could build any future together. "¿Qué harías ahora, mi corazón?" she asked the silent image, her voice breaking slightly on the familiar endearment. The weight of her isolation pressed down like the storm clouds gathering over the bay. Diego had been her anchor, her strategist, the one who always found solutions when problems seemed insurmountable. Without him, every decision felt like navigating by a broken compass in uncharted waters. Carmen had met Diego Morales 15 years earlier at the rehabilitation clinic where she worked. He'd been recovering from a construction injury, a fall from scaffolding that had damaged his knee and threatened to end his career as a supervisor. She had been his physical therapist, helping him regain strength and mobility through months of determined sessions. Their professional relationship had slowly transformed into friendship, then love, as she witnessed his incredible work ethic and gentle humor in the face of adversity. Diego had been the son of Mexican immigrants, a man who'd worked his way up from day laborer to construction supervisor through sheer determination and an encyclopedic knowledge of building techniques. Carmen, whose own family had immigrated from El Salvador when she was 12, understood the pride and purpose he found in building homes for other families seeking the American dream. Their wedding had been simple but joyful, held in the small Catholic church overlooking Monterey Bay. Diego's construction crew had volunteered to build the gazebo where they exchanged vows, creating something beautiful and lasting to mark their commitment. Carmen's patients from the clinic had filled the pews, celebrating her happiness after years of dedicated service to their recovery.
Together, they'd saved every penny to purchase their small cottage, choosing location over size because they both loved waking up to the side of the ocean and the lighthouse standing guard over the bay. Diego had spent weekends renovating their home, transforming the modest structure into something warm and welcoming. Carmen had created a small garden where they grew vegetables and herbs, finding peace and nurturing life from the earth. Those had been golden years, coming home each evening to share stories of their work, planning small improvements to their cottage, taking long walks along the coastal path, dreaming of the children they hoped to have someday. Diego would point to houses under construction around the bay, explaining the engineering challenges and architectural choices with the enthusiasm of someone who truly loved his craft. But children hadn't come, despite years of hoping and medical consultations that drained their savings. They'd eventually found peace in their life together, channeling their nurturing instincts into their work, Carmen helping people heal, Diego building homes for growing families. They'd talked about adoption, about travel, about the small bed and breakfast they might open in their cottage when they retired. The workplace accident had shattered everything in a single moment. Diego had been supervising the installation of steel beams on a high-rise project when a crane cable snapped. The beam had fallen, crushing him instantly. The investigation revealed equipment failure, a worn cable that should have been replaced months earlier, safety protocols that had been ignored to meet construction deadlines. Carmen's world had ended that Tuesday afternoon when the hospital called. She'd been treating an elderly patient with stroke recovery when her phone rang with news that would divide her life into before and after. Before Diego, when everything made sense. After Diego, when nothing would ever make sense again. The funeral had been overwhelming. Hundreds of people whose lives Diego had touched. Construction workers who spoke of his fairness and kindness, homeowners whose houses he'd built with care and pride, fellow supervisors who'd learned their trade under his patient guidance. Carmen had stood beside his casket, surrounded by mourners, feeling completely alone, despite the crowd of people sharing her grief. The legal battles had begun almost immediately. Diego's employer, Coastal Construction Corporation, had initially expressed sympathy and promised full cooperation with the investigation. Within weeks, however, their corporate lawyers were arguing that Diego bore partial responsibility for the accident, claiming he hadn't followed proper safety protocols. They disputed the workers' compensation claim, delayed payments, and fought every aspect of Carmen's wrongful death lawsuit. The legal fees had consumed their savings with terrifying speed. Carmen's attorney, while competent and sympathetic, charged $400 per hour for his services. Expert witnesses, depositions, document review, and court filings created an endless stream of expenses that multiplied faster than Carmen could track. Meanwhile, her grief made it impossible to focus on work with the intensity her patients deserved. The rehabilitation clinic where she'd worked for 12 years had been understanding at first, granting her bereavement leave and accommodating her emotional struggles. But as months passed and Carmen continued to have difficulty concentrating, her supervisor had grown less patient. The clinic was under financial pressure from insurance companies demanding faster patient turnover and measurable progress metrics that seemed to prioritize efficiency over healing. When Coastal Healthcare Corporation acquired the clinic 6 months after Diego's death, Carmen's position became immediately vulnerable. The new management wanted to streamline operations and eliminate redundancies. Her salary, built up over years of dedicated service, made her an expensive liability compared to newly graduated therapists they could hire for significantly less money. The termination was delivered with corporate efficiency, a brief meeting with human resources, a severance package that provided 6 weeks of salary, and a non-disclosure agreement that prevented her from discussing the circumstances of her dismissal. Carmen had signed the papers in numb shock, still processing the reality that she'd lost both her husband and her career within 8 months. Unemployment benefits provided $1,200 a month, barely enough to cover basic living expenses and completely inadequate for the mortgage payments on their cottage. Carmen had applied for dozens of physical therapy positions throughout the region, but the job market was saturated with qualified candidates, and many employers seemed hesitant to hire someone dealing with obvious personal trauma. The few interview opportunities she'd received had gone poorly. Carmen struggled to project the optimism and energy that healthcare employers expected, and her extended absence from work had created gaps in her knowledge of new treatment protocols and technologies. Younger candidates with recent training and lower salary expectations consistently received the positions she'd applied for. As her savings dwindled and job prospects remained elusive, Carmen had been forced to make increasingly desperate financial decisions. She'd sold Diego's truck, their wedding rings, and most of their furniture to pay mounting bills. The cottage that had once been their sanctuary became a constant reminder of everything she'd lost and everything she was about to lose.
That evening, after forcing down a dinner of instant soup and stale crackers, all she could afford and stomach, Carmen opened her ancient laptop and began the desperate search for affordable housing. The laptop, a relic from Diego's construction office, wheezed and protested as she waited for each page to load on their barely functioning internet connection. The numbers on rental websites might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the sense they made to her financial reality. Studio apartments in Coral Bay started at $2,800 per month, nearly 4 times what she currently paid for her 2-bedroom cottage. One-bedroom units in neighboring towns commanded $2,200 minimum, still impossibly beyond her reach. Application fees ranged from $75 to $150 per property, meaning she could afford to apply for perhaps 2 places before exhausting her remaining funds. Every legitimate listing demanded proof of monthly income at least 3 times the rent amount, an impossible requirement when her unemployment benefits provided barely $1,200 per month, enough to cover groceries and basic utilities, but nowhere near sufficient for housing deposits, first month's rent, and the mountain of additional fees landlords demanded. Security deposits alone often exceeded her entire remaining savings. Carmen spent hours reading rental requirements that seemed designed to exclude people in her situation. Perfect credit scores, employment verification, landlord references, proof of renter's insurance, pet deposits even though she had no pets, cleaning fees, application processing fees, background check fees. The list of financial barriers seemed endless and insurmountable. She called several property management companies, hoping to explain her situation and perhaps find someone willing to work with her circumstances. The conversations were uniformly discouraging. Rental agents spoke in rehearsed scripts about policies and requirements, expressing polite sympathy for her situation while making it clear that exceptions were not possible in their competitive market. "I understand your circumstances are difficult," one particularly kind agent had explained, "but we have dozens of qualified applicants for every property. Our owners require us to choose tenants who represent the lowest financial risk. I'm sorry, but your current income situation wouldn't meet our minimum requirements." Carmen expanded her search radius, looking at apartments an hour inland where rents dropped slightly, but still remained out of reach. She investigated shared housing situations, spare rooms in strangers' homes, converted garages, anything that might provide basic shelter. Each option presented its own complications. Most wanted female roommates under 30, non-smokers with perfect credit, professional references she no longer had, or deposits she couldn't afford. The Craigslist housing section became her obsession, refreshing every few minutes to catch new listings before other desperate people could respond. She found herself competing with college students whose parents could co-sign leases,
young professionals with stable incomes, and retirees with substantial savings. Her widow status and unemployment made her an unattractive candidate regardless of her education or work history. She applied for low-income housing assistance, only to discover waiting lists that stretched for years. Emergency housing programs had residency requirements she didn't meet or were designed specifically for families with children. Social services offered temporary shelter options that required her to surrender her remaining possessions and accept placement in facilities with safety concerns she wasn't prepared to accept. The clock on her laptop read 1:47 a.m. when desperation drove her into increasingly unconventional territory. She began searching foreclosure auctions, sheriff sales, repossessed properties, abandoned buildings, any distressed real estate being liquidated to recover debts. Most listings showed dilapidated houses requiring tens of thousands in renovations, empty lots in remote areas hours from any employment, or commercial properties unsuitable for residential use. Her eyes burned from staring at the screen, and her back ached from hunching over the wobbly kitchen table, but she couldn't stop. Each search felt like her last chance to find something, anything, before the 18-day deadline expired and she found herself homeless for the first time in her life. The storm outside intensified, rain lashing against the cottage windows in rhythmic waves that matched her growing anxiety. She could hear the ocean's fury even through the storm, the eternal crash of waves that had once soothed her to sleep but now sounded like time running out. The lighthouse beam, automated even in its abandonment, continued its eternal sweep across the bay, a reminder of persistence in the face of obsolescence. Carmen clicked through page after page of foreclosure listings, each more depressing than the last. Mobile homes in flood zones requiring expensive elevation work, condemned houses with foundation problems that would cost more to repair than to demolish, vacant lots suitable only for farming or industrial use, zoned against residential construction. Her heart sank with each impossible option, each dead end that closed off another potential path forward. She found herself reading the tragic stories behind each foreclosure. Families destroyed by medical bankruptcies, elderly couples who'd lost homes to reverse mortgage scams, small business owners crushed by economic downturns beyond their control. Each listing represented someone else's shattered dreams, making her feel simultaneously less alone and more aware of how common financial devastation had become.
And then, buried on page 7 of the Monterey County Sheriff's auction listings, she found something that made her pause. Former Soledad Point Lighthouse and Keeper's Quarters. Minimum bid, $120. Property sold as is, where is. No warranties or representations. Structural inspection recommended. Carmen almost scrolled past it. What could she possibly do with an abandoned lighthouse? But something made her click on the listing. Perhaps the desperate logic that even an impossible shelter was better than no shelter at all, or maybe the symbolic connection to the lighthouse that had watched over her marriage for so many years. The listing contained only 4 photographs: the weathered lighthouse tower with its faded white paint and corroded metalwork, the attached keeper's quarters with boarded windows, an interior shot showing dusty furniture draped in protective sheets, and an aerial view revealing the property situated on a rocky outcropping that jutted into Monterey Bay like a stone finger pointing toward open ocean. The description was frustratingly sparse. Former Soledad Point Lighthouse Tower plus 1,350 square feet keeper's quarters. Property includes all remaining fixtures and furnishings. Structure appears sound but requires significant renovation and restoration. No utilities currently connected. Zoned historical residential with municipal preservation overlay. Property sold as is without warranties. Buyer responsible for all inspections and due diligence. Carmen studied the photographs with growing fascination. The lighthouse tower stood approximately 60 feet tall, its white paint weathered but still visible against the storm-darkened sky. The attached keeper's quarters appeared to be a substantial 2-story structure with stone foundations and wooden siding that matched the tower.
Even in its abandoned state, the building retained a dignity and character that spoke of better days. Her exhausted mind began calculating impossible possibilities. The keeper's quarters could theoretically be made livable with extensive work and investment she didn't have. The lighthouse tower itself might never function again, but the attached living space had potential if someone possessed the skills, resources, and time to undertake a massive renovation project. The historical zoning meant strict limitations on external modifications, but it also suggested possible tax benefits for restoration efforts and potential grants for historical preservation. The isolation would be challenging, accessible only by a narrow coastal road that probably flooded during severe storms, but it would also mean freedom from landlords, rent increases, and eviction notices. It was completely insane. She was a physical therapist, not a contractor or restoration expert. The property was isolated, probably lacking basic utilities, and would require enormous investments of time and money she didn't possess. The minimum bid alone would consume most of her remaining savings, leaving nothing for actual renovation costs. And yet, as she stared at the grainy photographs of the lighthouse keeper's quarters, something stirred in her chest that she hadn't felt since Diego's death. A tiny spark of possibility, a whisper of hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be her solution. Not ideal, not easy, not remotely sensible, but potentially her only path to housing security and independence. Carmen imagined Diego's reaction to the lighthouse idea. He would have been immediately intrigued by the renovation challenges, already calculating structural requirements and restoration techniques. "Mira, Carmen, the bones are good. We could make this beautiful again." She researched the lighthouse's history, discovering that Soledad Point Light had been built in 1847 to guide ships safely through the treacherous waters around Monterey Bay. The station had been continuously manned until 1987, when automated navigation systems had made lighthouse keepers obsolete. The property had been abandoned for nearly 15 years, during which time it had deteriorated but apparently avoided major structural damage. "This is absolutely crazy," she told herself, closing the laptop and preparing for bed. But as she lay listening to the storm rage outside, knowing that 18 days remained before losing her cottage forever, the lighthouse continued to occupy her thoughts. What had seemed like midnight desperation began to crystallize into her best, perhaps only option for maintaining any kind of shelter and dignity. The widow seeking basic survival had found what might be her most unconventional path forward. The question was whether she possessed enough courage to take it. The morning of the sheriff's auction dawned gray and unforgiving, with fog rolling in from Monterey Bay like a shroud over Carmen's last desperate hope. She had spent the previous 3 days researching everything she could about lighthouse restoration, historical preservation requirements, and the legal implications of purchasing property at a foreclosure auction. The more she learned, the more impossible her plan seemed, and the more determined she became to pursue it. Carmen had withdrawn exactly $220 from her dwindling bank account, leaving her with barely enough for groceries through the following week. The extra $20 beyond the minimum bid was her only insurance against being outbid by someone with slightly deeper pockets. She clutched the cashier's check in her trembling hand as she drove her aging Honda Civic towards the Monterey County Courthouse, rehearsing arguments to convince herself this wasn't the most reckless gamble of her life.
The courthouse was an imposing granite structure with wide stone steps leading to heavy oak doors. Carmen arrived 45 minutes early, hoping to observe the auction process and understand the procedures before her lighthouse came up for bidding. The auction room was already half filled with people in business attire, professional investors and developers who attended these events regularly, scanning through thick catalogs of distressed properties like shoppers browsing a department store clearance sale. Carmen felt completely out of place in her simple black dress and worn cardigan, clutching her single cashier's check while others around her discussed multiple properties and investment strategies with casual expertise. She registered for bidder number 47, trying to project more confidence than she felt, as the clerk explained the rules and requirements. "First time at a foreclosure auction?" asked a distinguished woman with silver hair and kind eyes, noticing Carmen's obvious nervousness.
The woman's badge identified her as bidder number 12. Carmen nodded, grateful for any human connection in the intimidating environment. "Is it that obvious?" "We all started somewhere," the woman replied, introducing herself as Victoria Chen. "I've been attending these auctions for over 15 years. Are you looking at residential properties today?" "Actually, yes," Carmen admitted. "The old Soledad Point Lighthouse. I know it sounds crazy, but I'm planning to restore the keeper's quarters as my home." Victoria's eyebrows rose with genuine interest rather than skepticism. "That's fascinating. Historical properties like lighthouses can be incredibly rewarding restoration projects, though they present unique challenges. The Soledad Point station has excellent bones. I've driven past it many times. What draws you to that particular property?" Carmen found herself sharing more than she'd intended about her situation. Diego's death, the job loss, the impending eviction, her desperate need for affordable housing that wouldn't subject her to the whims of landlords or the volatility of rental markets. Victoria listened with the patience of someone who understood that desperate circumstances often led to unconventional solutions. "You know," Victoria said thoughtfully, "lighthouse restoration isn't as impossible as people assume. The structures were built to withstand decades of harsh maritime conditions, so they're typically very sound. The real challenges are utilities and modernization while maintaining historical integrity. But if you're committed to doing the work yourself and can approach it as a long-term project, it's entirely feasible." This unexpected encouragement from an experienced property investor gave Carmen hope that her plan wasn't completely insane. Victoria had successfully restored several historical properties, including a converted fishing warehouse that now served as her home and art studio. She offered practical advice about dealing with historical preservation requirements, finding contractors experienced with period restoration, and accessing grants available for lighthouse preservation. "The most important thing," Victoria emphasized, "is patience. These properties reward careful, methodical restoration, but they punish rushing or cutting corners. If you win the bid today, take time to thoroughly assess what you're working with before making any major changes." The auction began promptly at 10 a.m., with the auctioneer rapidly progressing through a list of foreclosed properties. Carmen watched the process with growing anxiety, observing how quickly each property was presented and sold. Most generated little interest, selling close to their minimum bids, but a few prime residential lots sparked bidding wars that drove prices far beyond their starting points. Commercial properties moved even faster, with investors making rapid calculations about rehabilitation costs and potential returns. Carmen began to worry that she'd misunderstood something fundamental about the auction process. Perhaps lighthouse properties were more valuable than she had realized, or maybe other bidders had information about the Soledad Point station that she lacked. As the morning progressed, Carmen's anxiety intensified. Her palms were sweating, her heart rate had accelerated, and she felt increasingly out of place among the professional investors who bid with casual confidence on properties worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. She began second-guessing her decision to risk her last resources on such an uncertain venture. When Lot 23 was announced, former Soledad Point Lighthouse and Keeper's Quarters, Carmen's stomach lurched with a combination of terror and anticipation. The auctioneer provided a brief description of the property, emphasizing the as-is nature of the sale and the buyer's responsibility for all inspections and due diligence. Ladies and gentlemen, we have the historic Soledad Point Lighthouse, a unique opportunity for restoration enthusiasts. The property includes a lighthouse tower and detached keeper's quarters totaling approximately 1,350 square feet of living space, zoned for historical residential use. Minimum bid is $120. Do I hear $120? Carmen's hand trembled as she raised her bidder paddle, her voice catching as she managed to say, "Here." $120 from bidder number 47, the auctioneer announced. Do I hear $150? The room remained silent for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Carmen held her breath, wondering if someone would suddenly recognize the value of the property and jump into the bidding. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she waited for competition that would price her out of her last option.
$120 going once, the auctioneer called, scanning the room for additional bids. Do I hear $150? Any advance on $120? A man in a navy suit near the front of the room half raised his paddle, then seemed to reconsider and lowered it. Carmen's pulse spiked with panic. If someone bid against her, she could only go as high as $200 before exhausting her resources entirely. $120 going twice, the auctioneer continued. Final call for the Soledad Point Lighthouse. Any advance? The silence stretched impossibly long. Carmen felt sweat beading on her forehead as she realized in a few seconds she would either own a lighthouse or have to somehow find another solution to her housing crisis with 18 days remaining. Sold to bidder number 47 for $120. The sharp crack of the auctioneer's gavel made Carmen jump. Had that really happened? Had she actually purchased a lighthouse for less than the cost of a security deposit on most apartments? The surreal nature of the moment made her wonder if she was dreaming or if her desperation had finally driven her to complete detachment from reality. The next 2 hours passed in a bureaucratic blur of paperwork, signatures, and transaction processing. The county clerk, a patient woman named Sandra Reyes, guided Carmen through the complex documentation required for the property transfer. She explained that the lighthouse had been abandoned for nearly 15 years, with property taxes unpaid since the Coast Guard had decommissioned it and transferred ownership to the county, which had failed to find a suitable preservation partner or buyer. You should know that this property comes with some unique challenges, Sandra advised, as Carmen signed document after document. Historical properties have specific maintenance requirements and preservation restrictions. You'll need to work with the local historical preservation office for any major renovations or modifications. Carmen nodded, trying to absorb the implications while still processing the fact that she now owned waterfront property, however problematic it might be. Sandra provided her with contact information for the county historical preservation officer, building inspection services, and utility companies that would need to assess the property before any restoration could begin. "Are you interested in the lighthouse's history?" Sandra asked as they completed the final paperwork. Soledad Point Light has quite a story. It's one of the oldest lighthouse stations on this stretch of coast, built in 1847 to guide ships through the dangerous waters around Monterey Bay. The station was continuously operated for 140 years before automation made lighthouse keepers obsolete. The clerk pulled out a thin file folder containing historical documents about the lighthouse. These came with the property records. There's some interesting stories about the various keepers over the years, including some legends about hidden treasure and pirate connections, though I suspect those are more folklore than fact. Carmen's attention was caught by the mention of treasure and pirates, though she assumed Sandra was referring to the typical maritime legends that accumulated around old coastal structures. Every lighthouse, shipwreck, and coastal cave seemed to have associated treasure stories that fired local imagination, while rarely having any basis in historical fact. The most documented keeper was a man named Fernando Vasquez, who operated the station from 1923 to 1956. He apparently was quite a character, kept extensive records of ships, weather patterns, and local maritime activity. Some of his journals are in the Monterey Maritime Museum's archives if you're interested in researching your property's history. By noon, Carmen Isabella Morales, widow, former physical therapist, and now owner of a defunct lighthouse, clutched a set of keys and property deed in hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The reality of what she'd done was beginning to sink in. She had committed her last financial resources to purchasing a property she'd never physically examined in a location she'd only seen from a distance, with no clear plan for making it habitable. "Congratulations," Victoria Chen said, finding Carmen in the courthouse hallway after the auction concluded. "That was quite an adventure you just embarked upon. I meant what I said about lighthouse restoration being rewarding. You've acquired something truly special." "I'm still not sure if I'm brave or completely desperate," Carmen admitted, staring at the keys to her lighthouse as if they were artifacts from another planet. "Sometimes those are the same thing," Victoria replied with a warm smile. "Here's my card.
I've worked on some challenging historical restorations over the years, including a decommissioned Coast Guard station that had similarities to your lighthouse. Call me if you need advice or contractor recommendations. And don't hesitate to reach out if you need someone to talk through the overwhelming moments. Every restoration project has them. Carmen thanked Victoria and walked slowly to her car, still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. The drive to Soledad Point would be her first opportunity to see her property up close, to assess exactly what she had purchased and begin understanding the scope of work required to make it livable. The coastal road to Soledad Point was narrow and winding, carved into cliffs that dropped precipitously to the rocky shoreline below. Carmen drove carefully, noting that several sections of the road showed signs of erosion and weather damage. During severe storms, this road would likely be treacherous or impassable, making her lighthouse truly isolated from emergency services or supply deliveries. As she rounded the final curve, Soledad Point Lighthouse came into full view for the first time. Carmen pulled over and stopped the car, overwhelmed by the sight of her new home. The lighthouse tower stood proudly against the gray sky, its white paint weathered but still visible. The attached keeper's quarters was a substantial two-story structure that appeared larger and more solid than the auction photographs had suggested. The setting was dramatically beautiful. The lighthouse perched on a rocky promontory that extended into Monterey Bay like a stone peninsula, surrounded by churning waves and wheeling seabirds. Even in its abandoned state, the station retained a dignity and purpose that spoke of its long service guiding mariners safely to port. Carmen sat in her car for several minutes, trying to absorb the reality that this remarkable place now belonged to her. The lighthouse that had seemed like desperate folly just hours earlier was beginning to feel like a possibility, perhaps even a gift. The structure looked solid and well-built, designed to withstand decades of coastal storms and salt spray. Using the keys from the auction, Carmen approached the heavy wooden door to the keeper's quarters. The lock was stiff with age and salt corrosion, but the key turned with effort, opening the door to her new home. The smell hit her immediately, the distinctive scent of a long-abandoned space, salt, dust, and old wood, but not the musty odor of rot or structural decay she'd feared. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the boarded windows, illuminating floating dust particles and casting long shadows across wide plank wooden floors. The main living area was approximately 20 feet square, with a massive stone fireplace along one wall. Period furniture remained throughout, draped in protective sheets that suggested someone had cared enough to preserve the contents when the lighthouse was decommissioned. Carmen moved through the space slowly, lifting sheets to reveal furniture that was old but appeared well made and potentially salvageable. A dining table with 6 chairs, a writing desk with multiple drawers, built-in bookcases along the walls, and a settee positioned near the fireplace. The furniture told the story of lighthouse keepers who had made this isolated station their home for decades. A narrow hallway led to what had been the kitchen, a large room with an enormous cast-iron stove, a deep sink with a hand pump, and extensive open shelving along the walls. Beyond that was a pantry and storage room that could be converted to modern utility space. The kitchen showed signs of the lighthouse's age, but the basic layout was functional and could accommodate modern appliances and plumbing with careful planning. A steep staircase led to the second floor, which contained 3 bedrooms of varying sizes and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub and pedestal sink. The largest bedroom had windows facing both the ocean and the bay, providing panoramic views that would be spectacular once the boards were removed. The plumbing was obviously antiquated, but the fixtures were solid and potentially restorable. A door at the back of the main hallway connected the keeper's quarters directly to the lighthouse itself. Carmen opened this door and found herself at the base of a spiral staircase that wound up into the lantern room. She began climbing carefully, testing each metal step before trusting it with her full weight. The staircase was solid despite its age, and climbing it felt like ascending through maritime history. The lantern room at the top took her breath away, not just from the climb, but from the spectacular 360-degree view of Monterey Bay and the Pacific Ocean stretching to the horizon. The massive Fresnel lens had been removed when the lighthouse was decommissioned, but the metal framework remained, along with the rotation mechanism that had once turned the beacon. From this height, Carmen could see the full scope of her property and its dramatic setting. The lighthouse stood on approximately 2 acres of rocky terrain, with natural landscaping of hardy coastal plants that had survived years of neglect. A small outbuilding near the keeper's quarters probably served as a workshop and storage facility. The property included its own freshwater well, though she would need to have the water tested before considering it safe for consumption. As a physical therapist, Carmen assessed the property with both practical and rehabilitative perspective. The structure appeared remarkably sound despite 15 years of abandonment. The stone foundations were solid, the wooden frame showed no obvious signs of rot or insect damage, and the roof appeared intact without major leaks. The plumbing and electrical systems would require complete overhaul, but the building's bones were excellent. More importantly, the space felt right in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Standing in the lantern room, surrounded by windows that provided views in all directions, Carmen felt a sense of peace and possibility she hadn't experienced since Diego's death. This lighthouse could become more than just shelter. It could become a home, a project, a purpose that honored both her need for security and her capacity for rebuilding.
She spent the rest of the afternoon exploring every corner of the property, taking notes about necessary repairs, potential improvements, and the sequence of work required to make the keeper's quarters livable. The immediate priorities were weatherproofing, utility connections, and basic safety improvements. The longer-term project would involve complete restoration while maintaining the lighthouse's historical character. As the sun began to set, Carmen climbed back to the lantern room to watch the daily spectacle from her new vantage point. The view was breathtaking. The Pacific Ocean stretching endlessly westward, Monterey Bay curving gracefully to the south, and the distant lights of coastal communities beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. For the first time since Diego's death, Carmen felt something resembling hope. The lighthouse represented enormous challenges, but also enormous possibilities. She had taken the most desperate gamble of her life and found herself the owner of a property that could provide not just shelter, but purpose, beauty, and independence that no landlord could threaten. The drive back to her cottage that evening was subdued and reflective. Carmen's mind raced with plans, priorities, and the overwhelming scope of work required to transform the lighthouse into her home. She would need to research contractors, apply for historical preservation grants, and develop a realistic timeline for the restoration project. More immediately, she had just 2 weeks remaining before her cottage eviction date. The lighthouse wasn't yet habitable, meaning she would need temporary housing while beginning the restoration work. Victoria Chen had mentioned the possibility of camping on the property during initial renovation phases, and Carmen began considering whether that might be feasible with careful preparation. That evening, Carmen researched lighthouse restoration in detail, reading about other successful projects and the typical challenges involved. She discovered that lighthouse preservation was a specialized field with its own community of experts, suppliers, and funding sources. Federal and state grants were available for historical lighthouse restoration, and several nonprofit organizations provided technical assistance for preservation projects. The more she learned, the more confident she became that her desperate purchase might actually be the beginning of something remarkable. The lighthouse offered not just housing security, but the possibility of creating something beautiful and meaningful while contributing to maritime heritage preservation, all while gaining secure housing and personal independence. As she prepared for bed in her cottage for one of the last times, Carmen looked out at the distant lighthouse beam that had watched over her marriage for so many years. Tomorrow, that lighthouse would begin its transformation from abandoned relic to her new home. The widow who had spent her last $120 on a sheriff's auction gamble was about to discover that sometimes the most desperate choices lead to the most extraordinary opportunities. The journey ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in 11 months,
Carmen Isabella Morales was no longer merely surviving. She was preparing to rebuild, restore, and begin again. The morning after purchasing the lighthouse, Carmen awoke in her cottage with a mixture of exhilaration and terror coursing through her veins. In the harsh light of day, her $120 gamble seemed either brilliantly inspired or catastrophically reckless, possibly both simultaneously. She had exactly 13 days remaining before her cottage eviction date, $127 left in her bank account, and a lighthouse that currently lacked electricity, running water, or any of the basic amenities required for human habitation. Carmen spread her notes from yesterday's lighthouse exploration across her kitchen table, alongside printed pages about lighthouse restoration, historical preservation requirements, and grant applications. The scope of work required was staggering, but she forced herself to approach it systematically, the way she'd once developed treatment plans for patients facing seemingly impossible recovery challenges. The immediate priorities were clear: secure temporary utilities, make the keeper's quarters weathertight, and establish basic habitability before her cottage lease expired. Everything else, proper restoration, historical preservation compliance, and long-term renovations, could be addressed gradually when she had shelter and stability. Carmen's first call was to Pacific Gas and Electric to inquire about reconnecting utilities to the lighthouse. The customer service representative seemed confused by the unusual request, eventually transferring her to a supervisor who specialized in rural and historical properties. "Ma'am, reconnecting utilities to a decommissioned lighthouse is, well, it's not something we see very often," explained Supervisor James Morrison. "The service lines were permanently disconnected in 1987 when the Coast Guard abandoned the property. Restoring electrical service would require a complete infrastructure assessment, new meter installation, and potentially rebuilding portions of the transmission line depending on weather damage over the past 15 years. The estimated timeline was 6 to 8 weeks for electrical restoration, assuming no major complications. The cost would be substantial, potentially several $1,000s for the reconnection work alone, not including the lighthouse's internal wiring, which would need complete replacement to meet current building codes."
Water service presented even greater challenges. The lighthouse had its own well system, but the pump, filtration, and distribution components hadn't been maintained for 15 years. Carmen would need to hire a well service company to assess the water quality and system functionality before determining whether restoration was feasible or if alternative solutions were required. "I have to ask," Morrison said gently, "are you planning to live in this lighthouse? Because if so, you'll also need septic system assessment, building inspection certificates, and compliance with county habitability standards before we can establish permanent utility service." Carmen explained her situation, the impending eviction, her limited resources, and her determination to make the lighthouse her home despite the challenges. Morrison's tone shifted from bureaucratic efficiency to genuine sympathy. "Look, I'm not supposed to suggest this, but given your circumstances, you might consider temporary RV-style utility connections while you work on permanent restoration. We can provide a temporary power pole installation that would give you basic electrical service much faster than full infrastructure rebuilding. It's not a permanent solution, but it could get you lights and power tools while you work on the bigger project." This was exactly the kind of creative problem-solving Carmen needed. The temporary power installation would cost about $800, still a significant expense given her resources, but manageable if she could find ways to cover other essential costs through grants or assistance programs. Carmen spent the next 2 days researching every possible source of financial assistance for lighthouse restoration. The National Park Service offered grants for lighthouse preservation, but the application process typically took 6 months and required detailed architectural assessments she couldn't afford. The California Office of Historical Preservation had emergency grants for endangered historical structures, but these were limited to properties already listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The Monterey County Historical Society maintained a fund for maritime heritage preservation, but their grants rarely exceeded $2,000 and were awarded only twice per year.
Private foundations focused on lighthouse preservation existed, but most required extensive documentation and professional contractor estimates before considering applications. Carmen discovered that the American Lighthouse Foundation operated a volunteer program that provided technical assistance and sometimes labor for worthy restoration projects. Their website featured several success stories of lighthouse owners who had accomplished remarkable restorations through determination, community support, and careful planning. She submitted an inquiry describing her situation and requesting guidance. The more she researched, the more Carmen realized that lighthouse restoration was less about having enormous financial resources and more about patience, creativity, and willingness to learn specialized skills. Many successful projects had been completed by dedicated owners who approached restoration as a long-term commitment rather than a quick renovation. She found online forums where lighthouse owners shared advice, resources, and encouragement. The community was surprisingly active and supportive, with experienced restorers offering guidance to newcomers facing their first preservation challenges. Carmen created an account and posted about her situation, receiving dozens of responses within hours. "The most important thing is weatherproofing and structural stability," wrote a forum member who had restored a lighthouse in Maine. "Everything else can wait, but you can't let water damage destroy what you're trying to save. Focus on roof repairs, window sealing, and moisture control before worrying about cosmetic improvements." Another member, who had converted a lighthouse keeper's quarters into her primary residence, provided practical advice about utilities and habitability. Start with camping-level comfort and upgrade gradually. A wood stove for heat, battery-powered lights, and a camping shower can keep you comfortable while you work on permanent systems. The key is making it livable, not perfect. The forum members also warned about common pitfalls in lighthouse restoration. Rushing the work led to costly mistakes and potential structural damage. Ignoring historical preservation requirements could result in legal complications and loss of grant eligibility. Most importantly, underestimating the physical and emotional demands of living in an active restoration project could lead to burnout and abandonment of the effort. Carmen began developing a phased restoration plan based on the advice she'd gathered. Phase 1 would focus on basic habitability, weatherproofing, temporary utilities, essential safety improvements, and creating livable space in the keeper's quarters. Phase 2 would address permanent utility restoration, compliance with building codes, and major structural improvements. Phase 3 would involve historical preservation, cosmetic restoration, and returning the lighthouse to its former glory. The timeline for Phase 1 was aggressive but necessary. She needed basic habitability within 2 weeks to avoid homelessness. Carmen calculated that she could accomplish the essential work with careful prioritization and some creative problem-solving, especially if she could find contractors willing to work with her limited budget.
Victoria Chen had provided several recommendations for contractors experienced with historical properties. Carmen contacted each of them, explaining her situation and asking for estimates on the most critical work. Most were sympathetic, but couldn't accommodate her urgent timeline or limited budget. However, one contractor, Miguel Santos, offered a different approach. "I've worked on several lighthouse projects over the years," Miguel explained during their phone conversation. "I understand the challenges you're facing, and I respect what you're trying to accomplish. I can't take on the full restoration project right now, but I could provide consultation and oversight while you handle much of the basic work yourself." Miguel proposed working as a technical advisor rather than a general contractor. He would assess the lighthouse's structural condition, develop a prioritized work plan, and provide guidance while Carmen performed tasks within her skill level. For specialized work requiring professional expertise, electrical, plumbing, structural modifications, he would coordinate with trusted subcontractors who might be willing to work with flexible payment arrangements. The key is understanding what you can safely do yourself and what requires professional expertise. Painting, basic carpentry, cleaning, and weatherproofing are well within most people's capabilities. Electrical work, major plumbing, and structural modifications need professional handling for safety and code compliance. This approach could dramatically reduce restoration costs while ensuring work was performed safely and correctly. Miguel's consultation fee was reasonable, and his willingness to work with her financial constraints made the project seem feasible rather than impossible. Carmen scheduled a meeting with Miguel for the following day, planning to walk through the lighthouse together and develop a specific action plan for achieving basic habitability within her deadline. Meanwhile, she continued researching specific restoration techniques, material suppliers, and equipment rental options. The cottage eviction countdown had reached 11 days, creating increasing urgency around every decision and preparation. Carmen began sorting her possessions, deciding what to keep, donate, or sell to generate additional funds for the lighthouse project. Most of her furniture would need to remain in storage until the lighthouse was properly restored, but essential items and tools could be moved immediately. Diego's construction tools, stored in their garage since his death, suddenly became invaluable resources rather than painful reminders. His collection included quality hand tools, a circular saw, drill sets, measuring equipment, and various specialized implements that would be essential for restoration work. Carmen had avoided the garage for months, but now she forced herself to inventory Diego's tools and equipment, recognizing how much money they would save on the lighthouse project. Among Diego's tools, she discovered detailed notebooks where he'd recorded techniques, measurements, and lessons learned from various construction projects. His meticulous documentation included sketches of problem-solving approaches, supplier contacts, and cost-saving strategies developed over 20 years in construction management. These notebooks would be invaluable guides for someone undertaking their first major restoration project. Carmen also found Diego's collection of construction and renovation books, including several specifically about historical restoration and preservation techniques. He had apparently harbored dreams of restoring an old house someday, accumulating knowledge and resources for projects they'd never had the opportunity to pursue together. Discovering this hidden aspect of Diego's interests felt like receiving guidance from beyond, affirmation that her lighthouse gamble might honor his memory while securing her future. The American Lighthouse Foundation responded to her inquiry with encouraging news. While they couldn't provide immediate financial assistance, they offered to include Soledad Point Lighthouse in their volunteer work weekend program. Experienced lighthouse restorers from throughout California would be willing to donate labor for essential restoration work in exchange for the learning opportunity and community service satisfaction. We typically organize these volunteer weekends for lighthouse owners who demonstrate serious commitment to proper restoration, explained Program Coordinator Sarah Mitchell. Your situation sounds like exactly the kind of project our volunteers want to support. If you can provide basic materials and coordination, we could potentially accomplish weeks of work in a single weekend. The volunteer weekend program was scheduled quarterly, with the next opportunity occurring in 6 weeks. Too late for Carmen's immediate habitability needs, but perfect timing for major restoration once she'd established basic living conditions. Sarah provided a detailed list of work typically accomplished during volunteer weekends: roofing repairs, exterior painting, window restoration, landscaping, and general structural improvements. Carmen realized that her lighthouse restoration was becoming less of a solitary struggle and more of a community effort involving people who shared her commitment to maritime heritage preservation. This network of support made the enormous challenges seem manageable through collective action and shared expertise.
The meeting with contractor Miguel Santos the following day exceeded Carmen's most optimistic expectations. Miguel arrived at the lighthouse with his assistant Roberto and spent 3 hours conducting a thorough structural assessment of both the tower and keeper's quarters. His evaluation confirmed what Carmen had hoped. The lighthouse was in remarkably good condition, considering 15 years of abandonment. "This is solid construction," Miguel declared, examining the stone foundation and wooden frame structure.
Whoever built this lighthouse knew what they were doing. The materials are high quality, the craftsmanship is excellent, and the basic structure has withstood decades of coastal storms without significant damage. Miguel identified the critical work required for basic habitability: roof patching in 2 locations where weather had penetrated, window sealing to prevent further moisture infiltration, chimney cleaning and fireplace safety inspection, and basic plumbing restoration to provide running water. The electrical system would require professional assessment before any power restoration could be attempted. The good news is that most of this work is within your capabilities, Miguel explained. Roof patching, window sealing, and basic cleaning don't require specialized expertise, just careful attention to detail and proper materials. I can show you the techniques and supervise the critical steps. Miguel estimated that basic habitability could be achieved within 2 weeks if Carmen dedicated full-time effort to the project. The material costs would be approximately $1,200, stretching her budget but manageable if she could secure the temporary utility connections and avoid any major surprises. Roberto, who had remained quietly observant during the assessment, finally spoke up. "Miguel, this reminds me of the lighthouse project we worked on in Santa Barbara. Same era construction, similar condition, and the owner accomplished an amazing restoration over 3 years." "Roberto's right," Miguel agreed. "This property has exceptional potential. You're not just buying shelter, you're acquiring a piece of maritime history that could become something truly special with proper restoration." As they concluded the assessment, Miguel provided Carmen with a detailed work plan prioritized by urgency and safety requirements. He also offered to arrange favorable pricing on materials through his supplier relationships, potentially saving hundreds of dollars on the restoration costs. "I want to see this project succeed," Miguel told Carmen as they shook hands. "Lighthouse preservation is important work, and you're approaching it with the right attitude. Call me when you're ready to begin, and we'll make sure you have the guidance you need." That evening, Carmen sat in her cottage kitchen surrounded by restoration plans, supplier catalogs, and budget calculations that told a story of hope balanced precariously against financial reality. Miguel Santos had provided a detailed assessment confirming that basic habitability could be achieved within her timeline, but the costs would consume every remaining dollar she possessed, plus the small emergency fund she'd been hoarding for absolute catastrophe. The temporary electrical connection alone would cost $850, leaving her with barely enough for essential materials and no margin for unexpected complications. Carmen stared at the lighthouse restoration plan she'd developed over the past 3 days. Phase 1 required immediate investments totaling $1,847, money she didn't have, but could possibly acquire by selling everything of value she owned. Her wedding ring, which she'd been unable to part with despite desperate circumstances, could bring perhaps $400 from a pawn shop. Diego's tools and equipment might generate another $600 to $800 if she could bear to sell the physical remnants of his craftsmanship. Her car, while necessary for transportation to the lighthouse, could be downgraded to an older, cheaper vehicle, freeing up $2,000 to $3,000 in equity.
The mathematics were brutal but clear. She could fund the lighthouse restoration, but only by liquidating every safety net and backup plan she possessed. Success would mean achieving housing security and beginning a meaningful new chapter. Failure would mean homelessness with no resources remaining for recovery. Carmen picked up her phone to call Miguel Santos, then set it down again. She walked to the living room window and gazed out at the lighthouse, standing sentinel on its rocky promontory. From this distance, it looked solid and permanent, a structure that had weathered 160 years of coastal storms and could provide shelter for decades more if properly maintained. But up close, she knew it represented the greatest risk she'd ever taken. Her phone rang, interrupting her brooding contemplation. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Morales, this is Dr. Patricia Williams from the Monterey Maritime Heritage Foundation. I understand you recently acquired Soledad Point Lighthouse and are planning a restoration project." Carmen's pulse quickened.
She hadn't contacted the Maritime Heritage Foundation, meaning word about her lighthouse purchase was spreading through historical preservation circles faster than she'd expected. "Yes, that's correct," Carmen replied cautiously. "May I ask how you learned about my project?" "Miguel Santos mentioned your situation when he inquired about historical preservation grants on your behalf. I hope you don't mind that he took that initiative. He's worked with our foundation on several lighthouse projects and thought we might be able to assist your efforts." Dr. Williams explained that the Maritime Heritage Foundation maintained an emergency preservation fund specifically for endangered lighthouse properties. They had been monitoring Soledad Point for several years, hoping someone would acquire it before weather damage caused irreversible deterioration. "We're prepared to offer a $3,000 emergency preservation grant to support your restoration efforts," Dr. Williams continued. "The funds are specifically designated for structural preservation work, roofing, foundation maintenance, weatherproofing, rather than cosmetic improvements. Would this type of assistance be helpful for your project?" Carmen nearly dropped the phone. The grant would cover her entire Phase 1 budget, with money remaining for unexpected expenses. More importantly, it represented validation from preservation professionals that her lighthouse restoration was worth supporting. "Dr. Williams, this would be incredibly helpful," Carmen managed, trying to keep her voice steady. "What requirements are attached to the grant?" The foundation's requirements were reasonable and aligned with Carmen's restoration plans. The work must be performed according to historical preservation standards, documented with photographs and progress reports, and the lighthouse must be maintained as a historical property in perpetuity. Grant recipients also agreed to provide periodic tours for foundation members and participate in maritime heritage education programs. "We'll need to inspect the property and review your restoration plans before finalizing the grant. Could we schedule a site visit for this weekend? If everything looks appropriate, we could have funds available by early next week." Carmen scheduled the site visit for Saturday morning, giving her 2 days to refine her restoration plans and prepare for the foundation's evaluation. The grant opportunity transformed her impossible gamble into a feasible project with professional support and credibility. After ending the call, Carmen immediately contacted Miguel Santos to thank him for the foundation referral and schedule the beginning of restoration work. Miguel was delighted by the grant news and suggested accelerating our timeline to take advantage of the additional resources. "With the foundation grant, we can do this properly rather than just surviving. We can use quality materials, hire professional help for the specialized work, and establish a solid foundation for long-term restoration success." Miguel proposed beginning work the following Monday, giving Carmen the weekend to complete her cottage packing and prepare for the transition to lighthouse living. He would coordinate material deliveries, arrange the temporary electrical installation, and supervise the critical structural work during her first week of residence. "One more thing," Miguel added. "Roberto and I discussed your project last night, and we'd like to volunteer some of our time to help you get established. This kind of lighthouse preservation is important work, and we want to see you succeed." The unexpected generosity from professionals who barely knew her reinforced her growing sense that the lighthouse restoration was meant to happen. People were emerging from nowhere to offer assistance, expertise, and encouragement for a project that had seemed impossibly isolated just days earlier. Carmen spent the next 2 days in a frenzy of preparation that felt simultaneously like packing for vacation and preparing for war. She sorted her possessions into categories: essential items for lighthouse living, things to store until restoration was complete, and belongings to sell for additional project funding. The cottage that had been her sanctuary was systematically dismantled as she prepared for a completely different life. Diego's tools and equipment were carefully inventoried and packed for transport to the lighthouse. His notebooks and construction references joined her growing library of restoration resources. She kept his wedding ring, but reluctantly decided to sell her own. The lighthouse project needed funding more than she needed symbolic jewelry, and Diego would have understood the practical choice.
The pawnshop transaction was emotionally brutal, but financially necessary. Carmen's wedding ring, purchased during happier times when the future seemed secure, brought $450 that would fund essential supplies and emergency reserves. Walking away from the pawnshop felt like severing another connection to her former life, but also like shedding weight that had been holding her back. Friday evening, Carmen stood in her nearly empty cottage, surrounded by boxes and bags containing everything she would need for lighthouse living. The cottage had been her home for 18 years, the backdrop to her marriage and the sanctuary where she'd grieved Diego's death. Leaving it felt like abandoning the last physical connection to their life together. But as she looked out the window at Soledad Point Lighthouse, Carmen realized she wasn't abandoning her past, she was carrying it forward into something new. Diego's tools would help restore the lighthouse. His construction knowledge, preserved in his notebooks, would guide her work. His memory would inspire her determination to succeed at this impossible project. Friday evening, Carmen stood in her nearly empty cottage, surrounded by boxes and bags containing everything she would need for lighthouse living. The cottage had been her home for 18 years, the backdrop to her marriage and the sanctuary where she'd grieved Diego's death. Leaving it felt like abandoning the last physical connection to their life together. But as she looked out the window at Soledad Point Lighthouse, Carmen realized she wasn't abandoning her past, she was carrying it forward into something new. Diego's tools would help restore the lighthouse. His construction knowledge, preserved in his notebooks, would guide her work. His memory would inspire her determination to succeed at this impossible project. Saturday morning brought Dr. Patricia Williams and two Foundation colleagues to evaluate the lighthouse and Carmen's restoration plans. Dr. Williams was a maritime historian with extensive experience in lighthouse preservation. Her companions were architect James Chen, who specialized in historical building restoration, and Susan Rodriguez, whose expertise covered coastal structure maintenance and storm protection. The Foundation team spent 3 hours conducting a thorough examination of both the lighthouse tower and keeper's quarters. They photographed structural details, measured critical dimensions, and assessed the condition of materials and systems throughout the property. Carmen followed along, answering questions about her restoration timeline and explaining her background and commitment to the project. This is exactly the kind of preservation project our foundation wants to support, Dr. Williams declared after completing the assessment. The structure is in excellent condition considering its age and abandonment period. Your restoration plan is realistic and appropriately phased. Most importantly, you clearly understand the historical significance of what you're undertaking. Architect James Chen was particularly impressed by the lighthouse construction quality and original design elements. This represents outstanding 19th century lighthouse engineering, he explained. The stone foundation work is exceptional, the wooden frame construction is solid and well designed, and most of the original architectural details remain intact. Restoration should preserve and highlight these historical features, rather than modernizing them out of existence. Marine engineer Susan Rodriguez focused on the lighthouse's ability to withstand coastal storms and salt air exposure. The builders understood the environmental challenges, she noted. The structure is properly positioned to deflect storm surge, the materials were chosen for corrosion resistance, and the overall design has proven its durability through 160 years of service. The Foundation team's enthusiasm for the project exceeded Carmen's most optimistic expectations. They approved the $3,000 emergency preservation grant on the spot and discussed additional funding opportunities that might become available as restoration progressed. We'd also like to document your restoration process for our educational programs, Dr. Williams proposed. Lighthouse preservation is a specialized field, and your project could provide valuable learning opportunities for other property owners and preservation professionals. Carmen readily agreed to documentation and education participation. The Foundation's involvement would provide ongoing technical support and credibility that could attract additional resources and volunteer assistance. Sunday evening, Carmen's final night in the cottage, she sat on the porch watching the lighthouse beams sweep across Monterey Bay. Tomorrow, she would begin living in that lighthouse, sleeping in rooms where generations of lighthouse keepers had maintained their vigil over maritime navigation. The transition felt simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. Her brother called from Denver, checking on her situation and expressing concern about her lighthouse gamble.
Carmen tried to explain the support network that had emerged around the project, the professional validation from preservation experts, and her growing confidence that the restoration could succeed. "Carmen, I respect what you're trying to do," her brother said carefully, "but this sounds incredibly risky. You're committing everything you have to a project with no guaranteed outcome. What happens if the restoration costs more than you expect, or if you can't make it livable quickly enough?" These were valid concerns that Carmen had wrestled with extensively. The lighthouse restoration was indeed a gamble with her entire future as the stakes. But the alternative, accepting homelessness or settling for inadequate housing she couldn't afford, offered even less security and no possibility of building something meaningful. "I know it's risky," Carmen replied, "but sometimes the biggest risks offer the only real opportunities for change. I can't afford to play it safe anymore because safe options don't exist in my situation. The lighthouse gives me a chance to create security that no one can take away." Monday morning arrived with crystalline clarity and a sense of momentous transition. Carmen loaded her car with essential belongings, took a final walk through the empty cottage, and drove towards Soledad Point to begin her new life as a lighthouse keeper and restorer.
Miguel Santos and Roberto were already at the lighthouse when she arrived, unloading materials and equipment for the restoration work. The temporary electrical installation crew was scheduled to arrive at 10 a.m., and the well service company would assess the water system that afternoon. "Ready to make history?" Miguel asked with a grin as Carmen parked beside the lighthouse. "This is going to be an adventure." Carmen looked up at the lighthouse tower rising against the morning sky, then at the keeper's quarters that would become her home through determination and community support. The gamble was no longer theoretical, it was beginning in earnest. "Let's build something beautiful," she replied, shouldering her bag and walking toward the lighthouse door. The widow who had risked everything on an impossible dream was about to discover whether courage and community could transform desperation into hope. The restoration of Soledad Point Lighthouse and Carmen Isabella Morales was officially underway. Behind her, the cottage that had represented her past grew smaller in the distance. Ahead, the lighthouse that represented her future stood ready for the work that would transform them both. The first week of lighthouse living tested every assumption Carmen had made about the restoration project. Despite Miguel's expert guidance and the foundation grant providing adequate funding, the reality of inhabiting a 15-year abandoned structure while simultaneously renovating it proved more challenging than any planning could have anticipated. Yet by Friday evening, as Carmen stood in the lantern room watching the sunset paint Monterey Bay in brilliant oranges and purples, she felt more at home than she had since Diego's death. The temporary electrical installation had been completed on schedule, providing basic lighting and power for essential tools. The well service assessment revealed surprisingly good news. The lighthouse's fresh water system was intact and functional, requiring only new filtration equipment and updated plumbing connections to provide safe drinking water. Miguel and Roberto had made remarkable progress on weatherproofing, sealing windows, and repairing roof damage with efficiency that spoke of extensive experience with coastal restoration projects. Most importantly, the keeper's quarters had been transformed from an abandoned relic into a livable space. Carmen had established her bedroom in the largest second-floor room with panoramic windows providing views of both the Pacific Ocean and Monterey Bay. A camping shower and portable toilet provided basic bathroom facilities, while the permanent plumbing was restored. The main floor served as her living space, with the massive stone fireplace providing both heat and a sense of cozy domesticity that made the lighthouse feel like home rather than a construction site. Dr. Patricia Williams had commented during her Wednesday progress visit, "You've accomplished something remarkable here. Most lighthouse restorations take months to reach this level of habitability. Your determination and Miguel's expertise have created something special." The Maritime Heritage Foundation had been documenting the restoration process for their educational programs, with professional photographers capturing both the technical work and the human story of Carmen's transformation from desperate widow to lighthouse keeper. The foundation was already discussing featuring Soledad Point in their annual preservation report and potentially nominating the property for inclusion on the National Register of Historic Places. Carmen had fallen into a routine that felt both purposeful and sustainable. Mornings were dedicated to restoration work, painting, cleaning, minor repairs, and gradually improving the lighthouse's condition and functionality. Afternoons were reserved for research, planning future improvements, and correspondence with the growing network of supporters and advisors who had emerged around the project. Evenings belonged to exploration and reflection. Carmen would climb to the lantern room to watch the sunset, then spend time reading about lighthouse history and preservation techniques, or simply sitting by the fireplace and processing the enormous changes in her life. The isolation that had initially seemed daunting had become peaceful, a sanctuary where she could rebuild both the lighthouse and herself without external pressures or expectations. The lighthouse itself was revealing its secrets gradually. Carmen had discovered evidence of previous keepers throughout the structure: carved initials and wooden beams, faded photographs tucked behind bookcases, personal items forgotten in storage areas. Each discovery added to her understanding of the lighthouse's human history and her connection to the generations of people who had called this place home. Friday morning brought an unexpected visitor. Carmen was working in the main living area, stripping old paint from built-in bookcases, when she heard a vehicle approaching on the coastal road. Through the window, she saw a battered pickup truck parking near the lighthouse, followed by a tall man in his 70s walking slowly toward the keeper's quarters. Carmen opened the door before he could knock, curious about who would visit her isolated lighthouse. The man was clearly nervous, clutching a worn baseball cap and looking around the property with obvious familiarity. "Excuse me, miss," he said with a slight accent that suggested Spanish as his first language. "I'm Fernando Vasquez, Jr. I heard someone was restoring the lighthouse and I grew up here. My father was the lighthouse keeper from 1923 to 1956. Carmen's pulse quickened. The county clerk had mentioned Fernando Vasquez as one of the most documented lighthouse keepers, a man who had maintained extensive records of maritime activity and local history. Meeting his son felt like connecting directly to the lighthouse's human heritage.
"Please come in," Carmen said warmly. "I'm Carmen Morales, the new owner. I'd love to hear about your father and your memories of living here." Fernando Jr., who asked to be called Nando, stepped into the keeper's quarters with obvious emotion. He moved slowly through the rooms, touching familiar surfaces and commenting on changes and improvements Carmen had made. His familiarity with the space was intimate and detailed, the knowledge of someone who had spent childhood years exploring every corner of the lighthouse. "This brings back so many memories," Nando said, standing in the kitchen where Carmen had set up a temporary cooking area. "My mother used to make tortillas on that old wood stove. We had chickens in the yard and a vegetable garden where you've cleared that brush. My father was so proud of maintaining this lighthouse. He treated it like a sacred responsibility." Nando explained that his father had been one of the last traditional lighthouse keepers, personally maintaining the beacon and weather monitoring equipment before automation eliminated the need for human operators. Fernando Sr. had kept detailed logs not just of ships and weather, but of local history, wildlife observations, and significant events affecting the Monterey Bay area. After the lighthouse was decommissioned, my father was heartbroken. He devoted over 30 years to this place, and seeing it abandoned felt like losing a family member. He kept visiting until he was too old to make the drive, always hoping someone would restore it to its former glory. Carmen shared her restoration plans and the support she'd received from the Maritime Heritage Foundation. Nando was delighted by her commitment to historical preservation and offered to share family photographs and documents that could assist with authentic restoration details. "There's something else," Nando said hesitantly. "My father left some materials here when the lighthouse was decommissioned.
personal items and records that he couldn't bear to remove. The Coast Guard told him to take whatever he wanted, but he said some things belonged with the lighthouse forever. I wonder if you found any of his materials during your restoration work. Carmen hadn't discovered any significant personal items, though she'd found various small artifacts throughout the lighthouse. She offered to show Nando around the property, hoping his knowledge might help locate whatever his father had left behind. They began in the main living areas, where Nando pointed out modifications his father had made over the years: additional shelving, a small workshop area, improvements to the kitchen layout. His stories brought the lighthouse's history alive, transforming the space from an abandoned building into a place where real people had lived, worked, and created memories. The tour continued to the second floor, where Nando identified which room had been his childhood bedroom and described the view he'd enjoyed of ships entering Monterey Bay. He showed Carmen a loose floorboard where he'd hidden childhood treasures and pointed out pencil marks on a doorframe where his father had measured his growth over the years. "The place I really want to check is the storage area behind the kitchen," Nando said as they descended to the main floor. "My father had a workshop space back there where he kept his navigation equipment and weather instruments. If he left anything behind, it would probably be in a sealed container or hidden somewhere protected from moisture." Carmen led him to the storage room beyond the kitchen, a space she'd only briefly explored while assessing the lighthouse's overall condition. The room was filled with accumulated debris from 15 years of abandonment: old tarps, broken furniture, boxes of unidentifiable materials that had been damaged by moisture and time. Nando surveyed the cluttered space with disappointment. "This is much worse than I expected. Water damage has destroyed most of what was stored here, but my father was careful about protecting important materials. If anything survived, it would be in a sealed container or hidden somewhere protected from moisture." They began systematically searching through the debris, with Nando explaining what various items had been used for during his father's tenure as lighthouse keeper. Most materials were beyond salvage, deteriorated by years of exposure to coastal humidity and occasional leaks. Carmen was moving a stack of water-damaged boxes when she noticed something unusual about the wall behind them. While most of the storage room was constructed with wooden planks, this section showed different materials and construction techniques. The wood appeared older and more weathered, and the joints between planks were sealed with a different type of caulking. "Nando, does this wall look right to you?" Carmen asked, running her hand along the irregular surface. Nando examined the wall section carefully, his expression shifting from curiosity to excitement. "This isn't original construction," he declared. "This looks like a modification my father made sometime in the 1940s. He was always working on improvements and modifications to make the lighthouse more efficient and comfortable." As they cleared more debris from that area, the extent of the wall modification became apparent. A section approximately 4 feet wide had been constructed differently from the surrounding structure, with materials that didn't match the lighthouse's original construction. The workmanship was careful and deliberate, suggesting this wasn't a quick repair, but a planned modification. Carmen noticed that one section of the modified wall showed signs of stress and separation. The wood appeared to be pulling away from the supporting framework, creating a gap that hadn't been visible when the area was filled with stored materials. "This looks like it might be designed to open," Carmen observed, examining the gap more closely. "The construction seems designed for access rather than permanent closure." Nando's excitement was growing as he studied the wall section. "My father was incredibly secretive about some of his projects. He always said the lighthouse had hidden aspects that weren't documented in the official records. I wonder if this is what he meant." They spent several minutes examining the modified wall section, looking for hinges, latches, or other hardware that might indicate how it was designed to open. Finally, Nando discovered a small wooden lever concealed behind a support beam. When he pressed it, they heard a distinct clicking sound from within the wall. "Try pushing on this section," Nando suggested, indicating the area where the gap was most pronounced. Carmen applied pressure to the wall section, and to her amazement, it began to swing inward on concealed hinges.
The modification was revealed to be a carefully constructed hidden door, designed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding wall when closed, but providing access to a concealed space beyond. "Dios mío," Nando whispered, as the hidden door opened up. "My father actually did it. He created a secret room." The concealed space beyond the hidden door was approximately 8 feet square, with a low ceiling that required them to stoop slightly. Unlike the storage room they'd been searching, this hidden chamber showed no signs of water damage or deterioration. The air was surprisingly dry and cool, suggesting the space had been well sealed against moisture infiltration. Carmen directed her flashlight into the chamber, revealing a space that had clearly been used for storage of valuable or sensitive materials. Wooden shelves lined the walls, holding various items that had been carefully preserved over the decades. A small table occupied the center of the room, with what appeared to be documents and equipment arranged on its surface. "This is incredible," Carmen breathed, stepping carefully into the hidden chamber. "Your father created a perfect preservation environment." Nando followed her into the space, his amazement evident as they began examining the carefully preserved materials. The shelves contained navigation instruments, a brass sextant, several compasses, and what appeared to be a telescope. Leather-bound books filled one section, their bindings cracked with age but still intact. But it was the table at the center of the room that captured their immediate attention. Spread across its surface were charts and maps that appeared much older than anything Fernando Sr. could have used during his lighthouse keeping years. The paper was aged and yellowed, with handwritten notations in faded ink that suggested considerable antiquity. Carmen carefully lifted one of the maps, examining it in the beam of her flashlight. The coastline depicted was recognizable as the Monterey Bay area, but rendered in a style that suggested the chart was much older than the lighthouse itself. Small symbols and notations were scattered across the map, with handwritten text in what appeared to be Spanish. "Nando, look at this," Carmen said, her voice filled with wonder. "These maps look like they might be from the Spanish colonial period. The style and materials suggest they're much older than anything from your father's time." Nando examined the charts over her shoulder, his excitement growing as he recognized the implications. "My father always said he'd discovered materials in the lighthouse that predated its construction. He thought previous structures or activities on this site had left historical evidence that was too valuable to discard." Carmen continued examining the materials on the table, discovering what appeared to be a ship's logbook bound in cracked leather. The pages were filled with entries in elaborate handwriting, with dates that seemed to span several years in the early 1700s. The language was archaic Spanish, mixed with terms she didn't recognize. "This is a ship's logbook," Carmen declared, carefully turning the brittle pages. "But it's much older than any vessel that would have operated from Monterey during the American period. This appears to be from the colonial era, possibly even earlier." As she continued reading, she found entries that made her pulse quicken with excitement. References to tesoro oculto, hidden treasure, detailed descriptions of coastal landmarks, and what appeared to be precise directions for locating concealed caches along the coastline. "Nando," Carmen said, very barely above a whisper, "I think your father discovered evidence of historical treasure caches. These documents appeared to be instructions for finding hidden valuables along this coast." The logbook identified its author as Captain Sebastian Montero, operating from various bases along the Pacific coast between 1720 and 1745. The entries described raids on Spanish merchant vessels, encounters with colonial authorities, and most significantly, the establishment of hidden treasure caches at strategic locations along the coastline. "This is extraordinary," Carmen breathed, realizing the implications of their discovery. "We're looking at authentic documentation of colonial-era pirate treasure hidden for nearly 3 centuries and preserved by your father's careful stewardship."
Nando was equally amazed by the discovery, understanding that they had uncovered materials of immense historical significance. "My father always said this lighthouse held secrets that went far beyond its official history. I never imagined he meant anything like this."
As they continued examining the hidden chamber's contents, Carmen discovered additional items that supported the authenticity of Captain Montero's records: Spanish colonial coins that matched the descriptions in the logbook, navigation instruments of the appropriate age and style, and what appeared to be samples of precious stones mentioned in the treasure cache inventories. "The question," Carmen said, carefully closing the ancient logbook, "is whether any of these treasure caches still exist, and if so, whether they can be located using Captain Montero's directions." Nando examined the maps more closely, recognizing many of the landmarks and geographical features described in the historical documents. "These directions are incredibly detailed," he observed. "Captain Montero was clearly a skilled navigator who understood the importance of precise location data." Carmen realized that their discovery represented far more than historical curiosity. If authentic and accurate, Captain Montero's treasure maps could potentially lead to discoveries that would not only secure her financial future, but contribute significantly to understanding colonial Pacific coast history. As the sun set over Monterey Bay, Carmen and Nando carefully documented their discovery, photographing each item and recording detailed descriptions of the hidden chamber's contents. The lighthouse that had been purchased as desperate shelter had revealed itself as the guardian of historical secrets that could transform everything. The widow who had risked her last $120 on an abandoned lighthouse was now the keeper of authentic pirate treasure maps, 280-year-old navigation charts, and documentation of colonial-era activities that historians had long suspected but never proven. Fernando Vasquez Sr.'s careful preservation had protected these materials for decades, waiting for someone with the determination to uncover their secrets. Carmen's lighthouse restoration had become something far more significant than housing security. It had become the beginning of a historical adventure that would test her courage, challenge her assumptions, and potentially rewrite the maritime history of the Pacific coast. As she locked the hidden chamber and prepared for another evening in her lighthouse home, Carmen understood that her desperate gamble had led to possibilities she could never have imagined. The real treasure wasn't just Captain Montero's gold and silver, it was the opportunity to transform desperation into discovery, loss into legacy, and an impossible dream into an extraordinary reality. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as Carmen decided how to pursue the treasure maps while protecting their historical significance. But tonight, surrounded by the solid stone walls of Soledad Point Lighthouse, she felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had taken the greatest risk of her life and discovered that sometimes impossible dreams hide the most remarkable treasures. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.